Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at the narrative of the Transfiguration, which was intended to give hope to the three closest disciples of Jesus. Then we moved to the fourth discourse of Matthew's Gospel, the church order discourse. In particular, we looked at the middle section of the discourse, in which the power to bind and to loose given to Peter in chapter 16 is extended to the entire community. Then we concluded with a look at the material on the power of prayer, which serves as an introduction to the parable of the unforgiving steward. In the current session, we conclude our discussion of the church order discourse with the parable of the unmerciful servant, or the unforgiving servant. Then we will take a look at the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. These are two of Matthew's dramatic parables. They get their point across through the telling of a story. Hence, it will take a little longer to examine them. Following the logion concerning the presence of Christ amidst those who gather in his name, Peter questions the number of times it's appropriate to forgive when wronged. Jesus answers Peter's question and then poses a parable as an example of persistence and resoluteness in prayer. The introductory dialogue with Peter on forgiveness begins with the simple connective then, tauta in Greek. Peter is identified, and we're told that he comes to Jesus and speaks. Lord, Kuria, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Note, Peter addresses Jesus with the polite address to a gentleman, Kuria, generally translated as sir. However, one wonders whether there is also a sense of Peter's admonition of chapter 16 here. Kurios also is the Greek translation of the divine name. Hence, Peter's use of the address can imply divinity. Peter's question is quite straightforward. When a brother, that is, another member of the community, sins against you, how often is it necessary that one forgive? Note, the notion of forgiveness is left somewhat general. It's not specified. Then Peter expresses what he considers a rather generous answer to the question. 7 times? How does Peter come to this conclusion? In the developing Talmud, the rabbis had taught that 3 times was sufficient for forgiveness. So in Peter's mind, doubling that and adding 1 was more than generous. Jesus' response is a bit surprising to Peter, and the other disciples for that matter. Jesus says, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7 times. 3 Greek words stand out in Jesus' answer. First, he does not accept the generosity of Peter, not 7 times, heptakis. Further, the answer that Jesus will give is totally in contrast to Peter's generosity, designated by the Greek conjunction Allah, translated with all its force, but. Jesus' answer takes Peter's generous 7, multiplies it by 10, and then again by 7. Give the symbolic meaning of 7. This would be a way of saying that the number of times forgiveness is necessary is indefinite. Turner puts it well. He says to be forgiven is to be freed and empowered to forgive. Whoever counts has not forgiven at all, but is only biding his or her time. Not wishing to present such large numbers, Others translate the text as 77 times. That really doesn't alter the meaning of the text. Either way, Jesus is making it clear that forgiveness is not dependent on a number. It's to be unlimited. Jesus then illustrates what he means through a parable about a servant who's unwilling to forgive even once. Matthew chooses to join this parable to the question of Peter through the connective diatuta, which is translated simply as on account of this or for this reason. The parable is thus seen to grow out of Peter's question. The point to be illustrated, the unknown, is then given. The kingdom of heaven is like. This is followed by the illustration, the known experience from the lives of the people. A man, a king, who wished to settle accounts with his servants. It's curious that the word king does not appear again in the parable. It's replaced rather by kurios, which means master or lord. It is most likely that the servants involved in this parable are high-ranking officials of the kingdom. They have, it seems, control of the finances of the master or the king, who now wishes to settle accounts. The accounting begins without further ado. The first servant to settle accounts is brought in. He's described as owing money, hence a debtor. Then the amount he owed is given. Murion talanton in Greek. This is literally translated as 10,000 talents. But I'm sure that translation means very little to anyone hearing this. That's why many translators also thought so, and so they simply translated it as a huge amount. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's do a little investigation. First of all, a talent in the ancient world was a monetary unit. It was equivalent to approximately 15 years' wages. Now that in itself is a huge amount of money. So this servant owed 10,000 of these talents. So doing the math, that comes to approximately 150,000 years' wages. Now that's a huge amount. A little more math. At $50,000 per year, that would come out to be $7,500,000,000. At $30,000 a year, the debt would be $4,500,000,000. That puts quite a bit of a different twist on huge amount. In fact, it makes it an impossible amount. At least, I'm not sure how anyone, even today, could repay a debt of 150,000 years' wages. Also, how would they incur that debt? In case you want to know what a talent looks like, here's a picture of some talents. Their size matches their value. However, I'm not sure how anyone would be able to carry these around with them. They certainly don't fit into any kind of purse or fold in a garment. Given this amount, it's clear that the servant is unable to pay his debt. As a result, the master does what's customary for the day. He orders the servant sold, with his wife and children and his belongings, in an attempt to recoup some of the loss. Those hearing the parable will side with the master and say to themselves, "Good for him! That servant deserves it, racking up so great a debt." The servant, however, is quick to respond. he falls to his knees and does the master homage. The verb that's used for do homage is proskuneo, which has the sense of worship, as though the servant sees the master as somehow divine. In the course of these actions, the servant begs the master, "Be patient with me, and I will repay everything." Now that's quite a request. Where is he going to get the money to repay such a debt? Multiple lifetimes would net him enough money to pay the debt. Clearly, the hearers would take this statement as ironic. They wait with bated breath to see what the master's going to do, although they feel that they know what he's going to do. But the master does the unexpected. In one of the many uses of my favorite Greek verb, splanchnizomai, the master has pity, esplanchniste, on the servant. Splanchnizomai denotes a gut-wrenching emotion. One would expect such an emotion, but severe anger rather than pity or mercy. The exact way he has pity is then described. He let him go. He releases the servant, canceling the loan. In essence, the man tells the servant, "Okay, it's all right. You don't owe me anything." The debt is canceled. I'm sure that those hearing this parable now are in shock. That's the last thing that they would expect to have happened. I can't help but ask, though, how rich is this master that he can just cancel a debt that large without even batting an eyelash? The Greek verb for cancel or forgive, aphiemi here, is translated with a double meaning. When the object is a debt or a loan, it is usually translated as cancel. When the object is sin, it's usually translated as forgive. This ambiguity gives us a hint at how the parable will ultimately be understood. Sin is seen as a debt that we owe God. So we come to the end of the first scene in the parable. We have then a very good example of Jesus' earlier dictum: ask and you shall receive. So the servant leaves his master a free man, in more ways than one. However, as he's departing, he happens upon one of his fellow servants, one who owed him 100 denarii. On the surface, this debt is quite a bit smaller than the debt that he had just been forgiven, it's usually therefore translated as a much smaller amount. Since again 100 denarii might not register in the contemporary hearer's mind, a little math is in order. 1 talent was equal to 6,000 denarii. So the second servant owed the first 1/600,000th of what he owed the master. Now that is a much smaller amount. So one would expect that the servant would be given a reprieve, or at least given the time to pay the loan back. However, that's not the case. The first servant wants his money, and he wants it now. He's so intent on getting it that he resorts to physical violence, seizing him. He nearly chokes him, saying, "Pay back to me what you owe." The second servant, I would presume, would be quite a bit taken aback by this. But nevertheless, he responds, curiously using the exact same words as the first servant did, with the exception of the adjective all. "Be patient with me," he says, "and I will repay what is owed." The plea for patience is much more reasonable than the original servant's plea. This servant actually has the possibility of paying back the debt. So, the hearers now shift their sympathy from the first servant to anger, while now being on the side of the second servant, being much more sympathetic toward him. Where the request for patience had netted a complete cancellation of the first servant's debt, he's learned nothing from his experience. He will not even listen. Rather, he goes and has the servant thrown into prison until he can pay. His failure to act with compassion turns the hearers totally against him. Thus, the second scene of this parable ends. Since this encounter took place out in the open, it was witnessed by other servants, who, on the basis of what they witnessed, are quite upset. That servant has been forgiven a debt that would take untold lifetimes to repay, yet he refuses to forgive a debt that could be repaid within a few months. They go to the master and recount in detail what has just happened. The response of the master is quick. He summons the first servant and addresses him, "Wicked servant." Note, because of his actions in regards to his fellow servant, this servant has become evil, wicked, ponera in Greek. Then the master proceeds to remind the first servant what he seemingly has forgotten in this short time. I forgave you all that debt when you entreated me. Two things are important here. First, the phrase all that debt recalls the nearly impossible debt that this servant had incurred. The notion that he entreated the master and was forgiven implies that similar action should have been taken by him. Was it not necessary that you have mercy on your fellow servant, as I also had mercy on you? This isn't a case of choice. It's a necessity. This notion has been seen before in Matthew's Gospel in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. God's forgiveness of a person must be reflected in that person's forgiveness of others. Matthew 6:12, Matthew 6:14 to 15. These actions of the servant have angered the master, who cancels his cancellation of the debt and hands this unforgiving, evil servant over to the torturers until such time as the original debt has been repaid. In other words, his punishment will last for the rest of his life, and the torture will be unending. Ironically, the treatment of the unforgiving servant is precisely what he wanted for his fellow servant who owed him. Now, the question is asked, if that servant is being tortured in prison, how is he going to get the money to repay the debt? The answer is his family would be responsible for repaying the debt. The illustrative story or parable completed, Matthew now gives the application in case it still eludes his hearers. Thus also, hutos kai in Greek, will my heavenly Father do to you, you plural, unless you forgive your brother from your hearts. So the Master is God the Father, who willingly cancels the debt incurred by our sins. A debt, by the way, which is impossible. So we must then be willing to cancel or forgive our fellow human being when they offend us in ways that don't even approach the magnanimity of our offense to God the Father. The lectionary now jumps to Matthew 20, passing over the teaching of Jesus on divorce, the blessing of the little children, and the encounter with the rich young man. It's possible that these texts are discussed in the lectionary cycle B for the Gospel of Mark, and my comments then can be found in the Gospel of Mark section of this website. The 20th chapter of Matthew begins with yet another of the more dramatic parables of Jesus, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. As with the preceding parable, this is a parable which is unique to Matthew. The parable is a story in two parts, the first concerning the hiring of the laborers, and the second concerning the payment of the laborers. The material in chapter 19 concludes with a saying or eulogium of Jesus. Many that are first will be last, and many that are last will be first. It's seen as a summary of what has preceded in the chapter, but also it's a look forward to what's coming in the 20th chapter of the Gospel. This saying or eulogium is connected or linked to the parable through the causative particle in Greek gar, which can lend to the translation, thus, for example, or as an example. This connection is further emphasized by the repetition of the eulogium at the end of the parable. In essence, the saying forms an inclusion or bookends around this parable. The parable begins with the typical, the kingdom of heaven is like, giving us the unknown that's being illustrated by the parable. Then the known experience is narrated. A householder who goes out to hire laborers to work in his vineyard. The common process of a vineyard owner hiring day laborers will illustrate a particular aspect of the kingdom of heaven. Given the movement of the gospel thus far, we can say that the householder more than likely represents Jesus, and the workers are the disciples. The parable then follows. It is, as we mentioned above, structured in two parts, with an appended eulogium or saying. The first part concerns the hiring of the workers at dawn, the third hour, at 9 a.m., the 6th hour or noon, the 9th hour or 3 o'clock, and the 11th hour or 5 o'clock. The second part concerns the payment of the workers hired at each of these times. Then the appended saying or eulogium. The householder, known as the oikodespotes, literally the master of the house, is the central character of the story. He appears from the beginning to the end of the parable. The parable then begins that this householder goes out first thing in the morning to hire day laborers for his vineyard. He finds workers and agrees with them for the wage of a denarius. He sends them into his vineyard. As we saw in the preceding parable, a denarius was a day's wage. And so the agreement made between the householder and these workers is a fair and just one. Thus far, nothing unusual and nothing surprising. About 3 hours later, at the 3rd hour or 9 a.m., the householder is out and sees other workers standing idle in the marketplace. He tells them, "Go into my vineyard, and I will give you whatever is just." Again, we see very little out of the ordinary. They most likely will receive pay in proportion to the time they work. They accept his offer and head off to the vineyard. A similar situation occurs at the 6th hour, or 12 p.m., and the 9th hour, or 3 p.m. He finds workers without work and sends them into the vineyard, presumably promising them a just wage. Now, why he keeps going out looking for workers and why he needs such a large number of workers is not really considered in the parable. Some suggest that it was during the harvest time when a large number of workers or a larger number of workers would be necessary. It seems that the householder took a stroll every 3 hours. As he is now out at the 11th hour, 5 p.m., a time when most day workers are thinking of being paid and going home. He finds still others who have no employment and questions them, "Why have you stood here idle all day?" Their response was, "No one has hired us." They wanted to work, but seemingly nobody wanted them. They've been rejected by all the other employees as unworthy. But this householder will not reject them. So he sends them. "Go also you into my vineyard," he says. The seemingly parallel structure of each of the previous hirings has now been broken. A break in structure tends to highlight what's narrated in the broken structure. There is a question and answer between the householder and the prospective workers. In the question, day recalls the original hiring, and idle recalls those hiring at 9 a.m. Hence, this hiring not only emphasizes that the workers have been rejected, but recaps the entire day's hiring and work. Thus ends the first part of the parable. The second part of the parable takes place in the evening, at the end of the workday, the time for the payment of the just wage to the workers. A day laborer would be paid in the evening of the day he worked, in accord with the dictates of the Mosaic law. Moses says, "The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until the morning." Leviticus 19:13, also cited in Deuteronomy 24:15. So the owner of the vineyard tells the steward, or the foreman, that is the servant in charge of the work in the vineyard, to call the laborers and to pay them beginning with the last, moving to the first. The workers are thus paid in reverse order of their hiring. This allows each group of the hired workers to see how much all those hired after them is being paid, which will be crucial to the point of the parable. So the payment begins. The workers hired at 5 p.m., the 11th hour, approach, expecting a rather small amount. And they're paid a full denarius, much to their surprise. Presumably, that's what each of the groups hired received. The narrative does not tell us specifically. No other group is mentioned until the ones originally hired in the morning approach. So, what is right? What is right seems to be what the original workers agreed to. That is 1 denarius. The household has made the decision to give a day's wage to each of the groups because he is generous. So the question in the back of the hearers' minds is, will the original group get more? The answer should be somewhat obvious, because this is the only group to agree to the denarius, and that's what each group has been receiving. Despite what the original hearers may think, the original group does figure that they will get more. However, they too received a denarius. So all have been put on an equal plane. They're not happy with that. They grumble against the householder. The Greek verb here is interesting. It's gongonidzo. It's derived from what seems to be a sound made by one who was muttering in a low voice in complaint. These last ones worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who bore the day's burden, that is, worked all day, and the heat of the sun. It's unfair. It's unjust. Equal pay for equal work. So the master, the householder, responds to one of them, presumably the spokesman, and says, "Friend, I'm not being unjust to you. Did you not agree with me for a denarius?" First of all, the householder addresses the complainant as heteros, friend, which is a word that is not frequently used in the New Testament. It refers to comrades or companions who were not necessarily there for help, but for getting whatever advantage they could. Hence, it seems to be an appropriate address. Secondly, the householder kept to the original agreement. He paid the agreed upon denarius, so no injustice has been done. They should take their wage and go. Third, the master wanted the last hired treated in the same way as the first. That's his prerogative. So he says, "Take what's yours and go. I wish to give to these last as I give to you." Note, beyond the agreement made with the first workers, the amount paid depended solely on the will of the householder. The traditional understanding of justice seemingly is being altered here. The householder then poses two questions concerning what's just happened. Is it not permitted to me to do what I wish in regards to my own possessions? He's free to give to the last, the unworthy, what they don't deserve. The not, the ook in Greek, expects the answer of yes. In other words, the hearers should say, yes, of course, you can do whatever you want with your money. The second question, again prefaced with the not, ook, expects another positive answer. Literally, the question is your eye evil because I am good? That needs a little unpacking. In the Middle East, the notion of the evil eye denotes envy. One who is envious is said to have an evil eye, an eye that wants what it sees of others' possessions. Further, the adjective agathos, translated literally good, here can also mean generous. So what the householder is actually saying is, are you envious because I'm generous? The notion of envy stems from the original worker's understanding of justice, which stands in direct opposition to the householder's understanding of justice and grace freely given. That is, the extra pay for working fewer hours. By giving to one, the householder takes nothing away from another. So the householder has been fair to those who worked all day and generous to those who worked for only a short time. Then Matthew appends the saying that led into the parable, but this time with a reversal. This time he says, the last will be first, and the first last. Exactly what happened in the parable. Many will quibble with the parable, saying that it's unfair. If we look at it from the point of view of pay for work done, then that may be possible. However, this parable is not about that. It's about eternal life. If we look at the comparison, the kingdom of heaven is being compared to the whole process of hiring laborers and paying them. Some are invited to work in and for the kingdom from early life, baptized as infants. Others are only brought into the kingdom on their deathbed. Yet the kingdom is the same for both. The reign of God is the reign of God. It's not greater for some and less for others. That's what the parable is trying to tell us. The rabbis had it right when they said, some obtain and enter the kingdom in an hour, while others after a lifetime. Well, that's about all we have time for this session. Tune in the next session where we'll discuss Jesus' arrival and entry into Jerusalem, and a couple of more of Jesus' parables unique to Matthew's gospel. See you then.